What's up, gangsters? I seem to be in a video making mood lately, and it's almost Halloween, so why don't we talk about ghost seams? See what I did there? Alright, so, corny dad jokes aside, the real reason that I decided to talk about ghost seams is because I'm dealing with one right now. This right here is the one half of the fuselage for the Hasegawa/Edward P-47N, and if you're familiar with this kit, and I think maybe even their 1/48 scale one as well, you know that it comes with two different tail options, which means that once you attach the tail of your choice to the front part of the fuselage, you have a joint that you have to deal with right here. And unfortunately, it is not a super good fit, and I mean, it's not horrible. I've certainly seen worse, don't get me wrong, but nonetheless, it wouldn't matter if it was perfect because you'd still have a joint there, and there is no panel line that runs vertically down the fuselage on a P-47, so you have to deal with the ghost seam, and I've got one right here. You can see it. Doesn't even require one of those special cameras that you see on those ghost hunting shows on TV. There it is in broad daylight. All right. So you can see that it is exactly what it looks like. A place where even after you've done all of your hard work, sanding and smoothing and rescribing and all of that, filling in particular, that you're still left with this sort of telltale, like a sink mark or a low spot. And just as a kind of a comparison, you can see a little bit to the left of that there is an actual sink mark. This sort of dark stripe right here, that is a sink mark. And that comes from where this rib right here was molded in on the back side. So, at any rate, now that you can kind of see exactly what I'm talking about, or what anybody's talking about when they refer to a ghost seam, let's talk about what causes it, or what we think causes it. There's sort of, I think, three potential reasons that this happens. The first and most obvious one to me, and I think this is probably more often than not the actual case, is that we just don't do a good enough job filling and sanding, and you know, because we all have limitations in our vision, and sometimes they just don't show up until later. Maybe it's because you don't have good enough light at your workbench, or because, like with gray plastic, it's pretty difficult to see these things. Like, that did not show up at all until I sprayed some primer on it. So, sometimes you're just not going to see them. But look, none of us, like to admit that our vision is not as bionic as we think it is. And it's always a lot easier to blame it on the supernatural. And those causes involve typically, I think, three issues. One is differential sanding, all right? And what that means is that whatever material you've used as your filler does not sand the same as the surrounding material because it's either harder or softer. So imagine that this was filled with a material that's a little less dense than this styrene, and when I sand it with my sanding sponge or sanding paper or whatever it is, that because it abrades a little bit easier, it actually ends up getting lowered a little bit more than the surrounding surface, and that leaves that slight telltale. I think that also is a pretty common cause, and it can certainly happen with softer filler materials. And I'm going to talk about filler materials next. All right. The next next reason that I think sometimes that people sometimes theorize as causing ghost seams is shrinkage, where basically you put the material in for your filler, you do all your sanding, you let it sit there for a while, days, weeks, whatever, and the material continues to cure and shrink and therefore settle down lower into the gap and leave you with a bit of a telltale there. Seems pretty plausible, right? And I think that maybe it's true sometimes. I don't know. The final reason that a lot of people like to quote as the cause for ghost seams are material reactions, where you do your filling operation, you do your sanding operation, and everything looks great. And then you come along and shoot some paint, or primer or paint, and suddenly there you've got a ghost seam. And that can happen even when you did the priming and everything looked good. And what the theory there is that, and this specifically applies to paints that are hot, lacquer paints in particular. The theory there is that the carrier, lacquer thinner in your lacquer paint, is hot enough that it softens and reactivates your filler material and causes it to settle, shrink, whatever it is, and leave you with that telltale. Now, that's one that I know absolutely can happen because I've seen it, and not even necessarily with a seam. What you'll sometimes get with a kit, and you can see this sometimes. I think it's more common with like car models. Where the molds are filling from multiple directions. You can see it with kits that are molded in metallic colored plastics. And what will happen is you've got plastic that's coming into the cavity from two different directions, and you get a wave front that meets somewhere in the middle. And it creates a sort of temperature boundary where the material cools and solidifies at a slightly different rate and produces different material properties. And you may not even see it, but when you go and shoot something hot over the top of it, it'll activate along that material boundary and create what looks like a seam, even though you've never touched it. The first time I ran into this was a few years ago. I was building a Porsche model, the Tamiya Porsche. Everything was going great. I shot some, did all my body work, priming everything. Everything looked good, and then I shot some Zero red on as my color coat, and all of a sudden I had a few ghost seams, and it was basically where the parting line was, where the slides on the tool joined the rest of the mold. And I was like, what in the actual ass is going on here? I mean, it was baffling because I had not done a single bit of body work in that area other than to just sand down the very slight parting line witness that was there. And it was a nightmare to get it fixed because at that point I was already into color coat. So I know that the chemical reaction theory of ghost seams is valid. All right, now let's talk about how to fix it, because really it doesn't matter what caused it, right? Could be any one of those four things. Bottom line is you've got to fix it unless you're okay with leaving that sort of a telltale there. And I certainly am not. So now we can talk about why this looks the way that it does. And specifically why it looks like I've sprayed some additional primer in that area, because that is exactly what I've done. All right. So what a lot of people will try to do is they'll think, oh man, I've still got a divot here. I've got to put some more filler in there. That's understandable as the first recourse, but it really is a mistake because for one thing, if the issue is a reaction or shrinkage or differential sanding, well, that's just going to happen to you again, right? I mean, you're basically just practicing insanity by continuing doing the same thing and hoping for a different result. So that's not a good solution. So I don't recommend that. The other reason is because, look, this is a flaw that's readily visible, but it's way too shallow to secure most filler materials, even if they bond to the base, okay, like a lacquer-based filler will, like Tamiya Putty, Bondo 907, Combi, like I like to use. Those materials, even though they will bond to styrene, they still can get yanked back out of a very shallow depression like that when you start sanding on them. And it can even happen with super glue. And I know this for a fact because I do a lot of dry fitting with super glue when the parts won't hold themselves together. I just use a little dab of super glue because I know that not only can I break those parts apart very easily because super glue is just a mechanical bond with plastic, but if I have a little, spot of super glue left there, that I can just get a knife blade underneath it and pop it right off. It's really not hard to do at all. So, anything that's got a mechanical bond can get yanked out of there. Same thing applies to epoxy putty type fillers. Again, it's a mechanical bond. Those are both definitely better than some kind of, water-based filler like Perfect Plastic Putty or that Vallejo bathroom caulk stuff, neither of which will bond to plastic at all. But still, you want something, if you're going to do it, that will bond to the plastic or to the paint that you've already got. So that gets to what I do, which is I do not try and go back with a filler per se. What I do is I actually use the same primer that I've got on here as a very thin filler that I can just spray in a spot where I need it. And that's what I've done here. This primer is Mr. Surfacer 1500 that's thinned 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner. And it works great. I don't think that it is necessarily hot enough to reactivate most fillers, but it might, especially if it's putty that you've got in there. It's totally possible. But you should note that in this particular case, that's not what I have here at all. What I have is actually sprue goo. And specifically, this is a new batch of sprue goo that I've been working with that I made with clear sprue as opposed to regular sprue, because clear styrene is the most pure form of the material. It doesn't have any fillers or additives in it that can make it soft or rubbery. And it's been working really good for me. And so I don't feel like that chemical reactivation is the issue here. I don't think that Mr. Leveling Thinner is hot enough to reactivate that sprue goo that's in there. So again, I don't really know why I have that ghost seam there. I don't have it on this side. Pretty good there. I had a couple of pinholes that I had to deal with, but no ghost seam. So again, don't really know what the reason that it's there is, but it doesn't matter. I still have to fix it. And so what I propose to do is put a little bit more primer on there and sand it down in a very specific way. And I will also sometimes use this. This is an old bottle of All-Clad ALC 309 microfiller primer that I don't use through my airbrush anymore because it went bad on me, got gritty. But it's great as a lightweight lacquer-based filler because it's kind of thick and goopy, and I can just grab a little bit out of here and brush it on. And it dries really fast and really hard. And this stuff is very hot. It totally will eat into the plastic. If you use some of this and then you sand it down, you'll be able to see how it's etched into the styrene. So that's what I use. Now, this is the point to say that what a lot of guys like to do here, this is a pretty popular fix right now for this issue, is that a lot of guys like to use an acrylic primer like Stynylrez to do this operation, because it definitely will not cause that reactivation issue if that is in fact the underlying cause here. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. Stynylrez is a great primer, and you can sand it down really nicely. It'll feather out really nicely, better than any other acrylic primer that I know of. But I just like to stick to the same material class as much as possible. And I know that even though the lacquer primer could reactivate that and again, more of the shrinkage or issue or whatever it is, the way that I'm going to sand this takes care of that. All right. Now, let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. This is not some kind of magic. All right. What I think happens in a lot of these cases is that dudes make the mistake of over sanding. All right, and let me show you what I mean. All right, so here's an 800 grit infinity stick, and you can see that I've got some scratches here on this part of this fuselage where I just got a little barbaric with my filing and sanding operation from before. All right, and as I sand this down, I get this wonderful property of primer where it operates as a guide coat. Okay, what the heck is a guide coat? All right, this is a pretty common thing with auto body guys, and that is where you use your primer and then sand it down to the point where everything is gone except what's in the low spots. Okay, right there you can see those horrific looking gouges or scratches or whatever they are showing up perfectly because the primer is still in them, even though I've sanded it off of everything surrounding those scratches. And obviously, if I keep sanding until those are gone, then I know that I've removed the scratches, right? That's how you use a guide coat. That's how you use your primer as a diagnostic tool. Now, that's fine and dandy when I'm dealing with a homogeneous material, all right? All of this is still just the base styrene. So if I sand that out completely and get rid of all of those, no worries, even if I'm using a relatively hot material on top of it, because there's not any filler there to reactivate, right? So those aren't gonna come back out as ghost scratches later on, right? So, it's easy to believe or think that that's the right thing to do with this ghost seam, right? Because obviously the logic is that the tops of those scratches are now perfectly flush with the surrounding surface, right? And they may be, assuming that I've sanded down far enough. And this is part of the problem is you don't really know if you've sanded down far enough to make them flush until you go over it with yet another layer of primer. Because again, and then again, you might conclude that those are, coming back from some supernatural cause, when in fact, you just didn't sand down far enough or they weren't completely filled. So it's pretty reasonable to think that you would do the same thing on this. But the problem is, again, you've got that filler material in there. And so you come back to the problem of differential sanding. So what I want to do, and this is what I mean when I say I'm going to sand this in a specific way, all I'm saying is I'm not going to sand it all the way down. All right? I'm only going to sand it until the telltale goes away. All right? And you can see that even with a few passes there, all right, you can still see it. All right? And it's important to do this in really good light, so that you can see that. All right, so I'm gonna keep sanding. I'm getting pretty close. Still there, but it's getting better. All right, you can see it. And this is one of those things where if I keep sanding and sanding and sanding, and it doesn't go away until I've blown all the way through the material, then I'm probably going to stop, put some more spot primer on there, and repeat this operation. Because what I am very specifically trying not to do is sand all the way through the primer. And this is the mistake that I think that a lot of guys make when they're trying to deal with these things, is they're just over sanding the primer. All right, so again, I'm just going to continue, and I'm trying to just stay in that area. I mean, it doesn't really matter if I go through the primer anywhere else, but what I'm trying to do is level this primer out. I'm trying to flat it, is what you'll hear auto body guys say. It's the same thing as when you're sanding before you polish a clear coat. You're flattening the orange peel or any kind of texture that's in there, so that when you actually start to do the polish, you're dealing with a level surface. And you can see now that's what I've got there. Okay, There you go. When you look at it in the light, you can see between those two panel lines where I was concentrating, no more ghost seam. All right, you can still see the ghost seam there. You can still see it there below that area where I didn't do any sanding. But right in between there, I've got a nice, deliciously smooth 800 grit primer finish that's ready for paint. And feel pretty sure that when I go back on top of that with another layer of paint or primer, that it's not going to go anywhere. It shouldn't. I'll know pretty quickly when I come back and do my final priming if it is in fact going to be a reaction or whatever, because again, it'll come back out. And yeah, so you could end up having to repeat this a couple of times, and that can get frustrating, but it is what it is. Good body work just takes time. Point being is that right there is how I handle the ghost seam, and I feel pretty confident that that's going to take care of it. Now, just as a check on that, okay, because I've been working on the Edward 1/48 scale Mustang kit, and as anybody who's ever built a Mustang knows, you got, if you choose to anyway, a lot of body work to fill all of the panel lines on the wings that are supposed to be filled for that whole laminar flow thing. All right, so, and I haven't cheated, I didn't look at this before. This has been sitting in the box now for like 2 or 3 weeks since I last had it out and worked on it. So if there was any shrinkage, that was going to take place, it's had more than enough time to do that. And it doesn't look like I'm going to be embarrassed on camera. I don't see any weirdness going on here. Well, maybe a little bit. Okay, hold on, I'll show you. Okay, so the panel lines in question are all, what you would imagine. They're all along here, running span-wise and cord-wise. And I do not see any of those. None of those. That all looks good, but I'm glad I brought this out. Take a look at this. Okay? Take a look at this right here. It's hard to see. There it is, right there, behind the guns. Okay? That is where that gun insert piece goes in. And you can see those low spots. And I promise you, they were not there the last time I looked at this. So, what would we say has happened here? Well, I don't know. I mean, I used Combi, the same filler, on this entire area. And the panel lines are fine. But this area had Tamiya Extra Thin in there because that's how I glued those inserts in. All right, same thing over here on this side. There's a little bit of a divot there in the right-hand corner. You can see it. So did the Tamiya Extra Thin, continue to cause that to shrink over a period of time? In the weeks since I've worked on this, I don't know, maybe, but this is an interesting result because then there's a lesson here in that it's probably a good idea sometimes to let these things just sort of sit and percolate for a little while before you commit to your final finish. Because I definitely would be irritated when I go to shoot Tamiya LP11 on this, because anything metallic is gonna make any sort of a defect show up. There's really not anything going on with that one, but there is over here on this side. So what will I do? I'll do exactly what I've been talking about here in this video, is before I commit to any paint on this, I will come back, shoot a little bit more primer on that, and fill those in, and then go forward. It's hard to believe that there would be any additional shrinkage or whatever it is that's causing that, because again, this is like 3 weeks on down the road. And that right there is a little bit deceptive, because the gap that's there was nothing like that wide. In fact, it was a very, very tight gap. So, and there was not that much filler on there. So again, it's kind of hard to say exactly what could have caused that, but I'm kind of glad it did, because it fits right in with the subject of this video. And I definitely can see that I've got a little bit of work to do there. But again, that's the way I'm going to handle it. All right, so I decided to go ahead and work on this because I've got to do it anyway, and I'm right here and in the mood. So I've gone ahead and sanded these areas, and you can see where the low spots were, because I'm still retaining some primer in there, and I really didn't want to go that deep, but I decided to just go ahead and sand it down, see what I got. They turned out to be a little deeper than I thought. But you can see, same thing there. Then that right hand corner, that little oval shaped patch of primer there, and it may still be a little bit low yet. On the opposite side, again, there were no issues on that side. Maybe a slight little bit. I don't know, it's pretty hard to see. Right there by my fingernail, there's a slight little bit. Probably won't worry about that because it's on the bottom. This one was more noticeable, and you can see I goofed. I went clear through, and you can see some of that tan colored combi filler underneath there. I guarantee you when I shoot some primer on that, that's going to show. But it is what it is. Now, same thing, I've been working on these parts, and I've been doing some sanding, and this is where I want to make a point about the specific way that I sand these. When I did this before, when I was showing you how I would sand that down right there, I was using this sponge stick. And these Infinity sticks are one of my favorite things, but this is a case where they are not necessarily the best thing. And the whole reason is because of that sponge, all right? So just imagine, that this right here, this square depression is a scratch. And I come along with my sponge stick, and I'm sanding really hard, and I'm mashing down really hard. And look what the sponge is doing. It's going down into the divot, right? Well, that's not a good thing, because especially if you're dealing with the mother of all ghost seams, which that's kind of what this sink mark right here is, if you just keep letting your sanding material sink down in there and follow that curvature, which is what's going to happen if you're using a sponge and mashing down on it hard enough, it's never going to go away. You're just going to be chasing your tail. So if you're going to use a sponge, you want to use it very, very lightly so that it's not conforming to the surface. And even so, with something that's as shallow as this thing right here is, it's almost impossible to prevent that from happening. So what I do instead is, this is where I go old school, pick up a piece of 600 grit wet or dry paper, and I run it wet, because that, it's relatively stiff, and it's going to basically plane across the low spot without falling down into it, as long as I'm sanding very, very lightly. And so let me just show you what I mean by that, all right? Just trying really hard not to over sand. I'm letting the paper do the work, and I'm not putting hardly any pressure on that at all. Just letting that paper plane across there and hopefully leave me with a level surface. And that will take out the high spots pretty effectively. Smooths that right off, and you can kind of see there may still be a little bit of some low spots there. I don't know, but look, point being here is, if you're not picking up on it, is Sanding, all sanding is not the same. Anybody who says that sanding is not a skill or laughs at the idea that it is just ignorant, and chances are that their body work's not very good, because sanding is definitely a skill, and learning how to apply your abrasives according to the exact situation that you're dealing with really is an important part of getting a good finish. So there you go. What I'm going to do now is go back and shoot some primer on all this stuff. And it'll be really interesting. I am not going to pick this back up for quite a while. I really don't even need to be working on this right now because I'm not in any hurry to finish this project. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when I shoot another coat of primer on all this, and then come back and look at it again in a few weeks or a month or whatever it is when I pick this project back up again, to note whether or not this joint that looks so good right now will end up showing some shrinkage down the road like this did. And if it does, I'll definitely let you guys know in one of my 10 minutes of random videos. All right, so I hope you found that useful. Ghost seams are the bane of model makers. I think we've all run into it at one time or another, and it's not always easy to figure out what to do about it. This is how I handle them, and I hope it helps you when you run into it, as you almost inevitably will. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Much love.